Thank you, Dr. Banks. Good afternoon, everybody. Oh, okay, you all are scaring me. When I was in Oakwood, nobody wanted afternoon class, the class after lunch. Um, so hopefully y'all will encourage me when I give you a second chance. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you. Thank you for coming. I appreciate you standing by, and I appreciate the opportunity to come back. This is actually my fourth time. The first time I actually was a child. My parents were good friends with the Scales. Some of you remember William Scales Jr. and Sr. My parents were very good friends with him when Elder Scales Jr. was the pastor here. We came and visited him. Mrs. Scales Sr. was a great cook. Just thoroughly enjoyed that. Elder Scales Jr. did my father's funeral. I did Mrs. Elder and Mrs. Scales Sr.'s funerals. So our families were very close. So the first time I came was as a child, and then I came back to do the wedding of Dwayne Shorter and his wife when Dr. Donaldson was here. So I came twice. So this is my fourth time here, and thoroughly enjoyed it. And so thank you for allowing me to come. This is a really important subject. And so we just want to kind of dive into it. Basically, what we're going to do, this is, if I was doing a thesis sentence, it would be this: the history of and the continuing need for regional conferences in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. All right? Because my office is probably an office that exactly zero of you have ever heard of before, the Office for Regional Conference Ministries. Think of the Columbia Union. You're all members of Columbia Union. Regional conferences operate like a union. And let me give you a couple things that unions do. I grew up in Columbia Union, so you have a union, a newspaper called The Visitor, right? You get that, right? The regional conferences have a newspaper that they do quarterly online. It's called the Regional Voice, right? One of the things that unions do is they support financially higher education. So your school it used to be Columbia Union, now it's Washington Adventist. Well, all the regional conferences support Oakwood. They probably roughly about $10 million between the 9 of them. When I was in South Central, because South Central is in, Oakwood is in South Central's territory, we did a little over $1 million a year of our tithe that went. Another enterprise that all of you've heard of that regional conferences support financially is Breath of Life. You've all heard Breath of Life, Debelier Snell, who's probably the best preacher we have in our church. Our office contributes approximately $300,000 to keep him on the air and pay the salaries of his staff, so forth and so on. Next year, the young people will have United Youth Congress. That's something that the reason why we're able to do that is all the conferences make a contribution, they send it to my office then turns it around to support the young people. That's something else that we support. Message Magazine. You've heard of Message Magazine? Our office contributes roughly $100,000 to the running of the the Message Magazine. All right? So the way unions get the money that they get to operate is all conferences contribute a certain portion of their income. So when for example, when you returned your tithe today, let's say you're one of those really well-off, the only person whose name, well, I know a couple of people, but I started to say your principal, but I know she doesn't make a whole lot of money because she works for the church like I do. But let's pretend like she made a whole lot of money, and let's say she put in $1,000 of tithe, $1,000 of tithe today, all right? About $250 of that 1,000 doesn't stay at Allegheny East. About 25% of your tithe dollars go to support what's called the higher entities, the union, the division. The only money that's produced in the church is on the local level from people like you. The General Conference does not produce any income. The North American Division doesn't produce any. The Columbia Union, it all starts here and goes up, all right? So the same thing happens with the regional conferences. The reason why your money doesn't stay here is because, I know you wish it did, but the reason why it doesn't is we have a commission to take the gospel to all the world. The only way we can do that is to have an organization. And you know, people don't always like the organization, but the organization does things that your local church can't do, right? Your local church cannot take the gospel around the world. Can't do that. It's not set up to do that, all right? So we do what's called tithe sharing, and the reason and the advantage to sharing tithe is by pooling our money, we can do things that an individual entity can't do, all right? So the regional conferences pool their money, and they do the things that I just mentioned. Breath of Life, United Youth Congress, PELC, which is where all the pastors come. Our office, I'll give you one final example, that if you come to Huntsville, you will come to our office where the retirement program operates. And the retirement program is probably one of the best things that we've done. Under the old system, the NAD had a retirement program that took care of, well, at least it was supposed to take care of, they really didn't, supposed to take care of the workers in retirement. But here's the catch. Under the old system, you would work 40 years, and then you'd get around $1,200 a month. And that was your retirement. $1,200 a month. All right? Not a week, a month. All right? Despite the fact that they didn't pay very much. So Miss Principal, when you retire, you're a young woman, but one day you're going to retire if the Lord doesn't come. And in the old days, you would get about $1,200. All right? I don't think you could live off of that. All right. Okay. But despite them not paying very much, and they discovered at the year 2000, they were $1 billion, not a million, $1 billion underfunded, $1 billion. So the next time people say black people don't know how to run things, tell them that at least we didn't run the pension program $1 billion in the hole, $1 billion. So what they did was they said, okay, we're going to maintain our commitment to our retirees. We're not going to take away their money, but everybody who's not retired, you're out of luck because the retirement program ends on January 1, 2000. Now imagine, let's say you're in year 35. You were in trouble, okay? Let me tell you who was really in trouble though. The North American Division's pension plan had a benefit for the spouses, and in those days it was almost all women, the spouses of workers, okay? Because in those days There weren't a whole lot of females except for school teachers. And so if you were married to a pastor, for example, when the pastor died, then you got a percentage of what the pastor made. They cut that out. Let me tell you what that meant. It meant that all the people who were retired in 2000, when their spouses died, they got nothing. Let me tell you why that was such a problem. Because if you were retired in 2000, more than likely your spouse had not worked. Because in those days, especially the spouses of ministers didn't work. They worked with their husbands. So now, all of a sudden, when your husband died, you had nothing, right? So what the regional conferences did, because regional conferences control their own resources, what they did was they started their own retirement program, all right? And you don't have to work for 40 years. Now you can work for 30 years. I am going to retire at the end of next year. When I do retire, because I work for South Central, who also had a retirement program, because our retirement program is much better, when I retire, between Social Security and what South Central does and what the regional conference do, I will make more in salary than I make now. Somebody ought to say, at least you, Principal Nugent, at least you and Dr. Banks, you just say amen. That's right. But because regional conferences pool, one of the best things this church does is one of the things that's most complained about. We share our tithe. But that means the church as a whole can do things that individual churches could not do because we share tithe. All right? All right. So that gives you kind of an idea of what my office does. All right. So the next time you hear the Office for Regional Conference Ministries, you will actually know what they do. And let me tell you this final thing that we did that I think is probably the second best thing we did. Any entity, any organization has to operate out of something, out of an office. We were operating out of a rented storefront, which was hardly representative of the headquarters of the Black Work. A year and a half ago, we moved into a $9 million, 32,000 square foot, two-story building, okay? Because regional conferences pool their resources, when we moved into that $9 million building, that's what it costs. That's not what it's worth, that's what it cost, all right? When we moved into that $9 million building, we owed $0. Oh, no, y'all are not hearing me today. $9 million with zero debt. Now, if we had to borrow $9 million, it would have cost us roughly $20 million more to pay that $9 million back. So that $9 million building would have actually cost $30 million. That's $30 million that's going to go into some other level of ministry instead of somebody's bank. Because regional conferences, A, control their own resources, and B, pool their own resources. All right? All right. Okay, now let's talk about a little history. Okay. There are a couple of things that we do. The first Sabbath of every month, we have what's called the First Sabbath series. All right, kind of a real ingenious name, First Sabbath. And each First Sabbath, it's an interview program. We interview newsmakers and leaders. We've interviewed the General Conference president. We've interviewed the North American Division president. We interviewed the General Conference treasurer, who is the first Black person ever to hold that position. All right? And so it's on the ORCM YouTube channel or the ORCM Facebook channel, either one. This month, which is next month rather, we will interview the regional conference presidents. All right? We also, every month, do the regional voice. That's online, and at the end, I'll give you how you can access that. All right, now let's talk some history. What is a regional conference? Most people, when they think of regional conferences, they think of black conferences. Technically, that's not true. Regional conferences do not refer to ethnicity, they refer to territory. In other words, regional conferences are all the churches in a region coming together to form a conference, as opposed to all the churches in a state. In North America, there are two kinds of conferences. State conferences, which are all the churches in a state. So we have, Allegheny East is an example of a regional conference. Once upon a time, when I was growing up, Allegheny East was just Allegheny, and it formed a territory which is now Allegheny East and Allegheny West. That was a huge conference, so they split it up, all right? But inside those regional conferences are state conferences. The Pennsylvania Conference, the New Jersey Conference, the Potomac Conference, which is the Washington, D.C. area, Virginia, that kind of thing. So regional conferences, all the conferences in a region. So for example, Allegheny East is New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Virginia, except for the western side of Virginia. Okay, those are all the churches in a region. State conferences are all the churches in a state. Regional conferences are primarily African American administered. State conferences are primarily, though no longer exclusively, Caucasian administered. Okay? All right? So, now that we know the difference, then the question becomes, why do we have two? Why do we have two different organizations running the same church in the same city? All right? So, in Richmond, I am certain, in fact, I know because I have a friend that goes to the Potomac Conference Church. All right? I forget the name of it. Okay. Very good. All right. So why do we have two different entities of the same church operating the same territory? When I was president of South Central, our office was in Nashville. 10 miles from my office was the state conference office. So in the same city, you had two headquarters. Okay? If I'm remembering correctly, which at my age I may not be, but if I'm remembering correctly, we had one city where not only did we have the state conference church and the regional conference church in the same city, two different churches, they were on the same street. Okay, so why is that? And then the corollary to that question is, aren't regional conferences, who came second, aren't they an unnecessary duplication? People say, Elder Edmond, in heaven, there's not going to be a white conference and a black. You've heard that, right? There's not going to be any conferences in heaven. There's not going to be a general conference in heaven. But nobody says, let's get rid of the general conferences. Usually when people say, let's get, I don't believe in these separate conferences, let's all come together. You've heard that? Usually what they mean is they do not mean that the Potomac Conference is coming to you. What they mean is they want you to close down and come to them. All right? Because they will say that you are unnecessarily duplicating. But is that true? All right, If I can have 6 of you to come down and help me, we can answer that question. So I need 6 people to get up and come down and help me with this illustration. All right? So there you go. That's 1. All right. That's Mrs. Shorter. And she told me that she and her husband are still together after 25. After me marrying them, they're still married. All right. And my classmate, Elder Jefferson and his wife. I need 2 more people. All right. I see the pastor, and no, she's going out the door. All right. Don't move. All right. Dr. and Mrs. Banks. All right. Mrs. Shorter. All right. Now, you get to be the first regional conferences is called the Lake Region Conference. That's the conferences in the Midwest. Their office is in suburban Chicago. So, Mrs. Shorter, since I've known you actually I haven't known you long because I knew Brother Jefferson before I knew you, but we'll start with you. You are Mrs. Lake Region. All right. Now, the Lake Region Conference consists of the states of Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. So she contains all of those states. Inside the same territory where she is, there are 5 state conferences. All right, 5. Okay, so you get to be Lake Region, all right? But you are the Illinois Conference, right? You are the Indiana Conference. You are the Michigan Conference. You are the Wisconsin Conference, and you are Minnesota. Got it? She's Mrs. Lake Region. Now, Mrs. Lake Region, she has a conference office. Real nice one, man. They built it about 5 or 6 years ago. Real nice, real nice. It's in suburban Chicago. She has a conference office. But you, Miss Illinois Conference, you have a conference office. All right? Indiana, you have a conference office. Michigan, you have a conference office. Wisconsin, you have a conference office. And Minnesota, you have one. All right? You have a campground. It's in Michigan, Cassapas, Michigan, right? But guess what? You have a campground. 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 All right? She has a conference president, Elder Garth Gabriel, right? But guess what? You have a president. 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 All right? Inside that conference office, she has departmental people. When I did your wedding, I was the youth director, all right? So you have a youth director. But guess what? You have a youth director. You have a youth. All 5 of you have the same things that she has. So here's 2 questions. Who's really duplicating services? Her or all of y'all? Okay, who costs less to operate? Her or all of y'all? But these 5 say to her, let's all come together. But they're not coming to her, even though over the last 80 years, she's grown 4 times faster than them. Even though she operates with 60% of their income, which means she does more with less. They have tens of millions of dollars more than she does. But they also cost tens of millions of dollars more to operate. But when you don't know your history, you swallow the Kool-Aid that says what needs to happen is she needs to shut down and join them. All right, thank you very much. All right, Remember I told you there are 9 regional conferences, right? Okay. In the same geographic territory of those 9 regional conferences are 30 state conferences. The difference in operational costs between the 9 and the 30 are literally hundreds of millions of dollars. But the regional conferences are the ones that are told that they are the duplication of services. Now the reality is we need both. We need both, okay? But that's not the narrative. The narrative is that regional conferences are what's unnecessary. And when I do these seminars, some of the loudest opposition to regional conferences, because I've done these in Caucasian settings, okay? I've done the same seminar more than once in a Caucasian setting. The opposition never comes from the Caucasians. The opposition comes from African Americans. All right? All right, now let's get into some history. Charles Kinney, did y'all know Charles Kinney has a connection to your church? Yeah, Charles Kinney pastored. Isn't that right, Pastor? He pastored, was it Ephesus then? Okay, all right. We have to go by their word, Dr. Banks. We weren't around then. We weren't around. Okay, all right. All right, Charles Kinney was, in addition to being a pastor here, Charles Kinney was the first African-American pastor to become ordained, all right? What ordination is, you've heard a lot of discussion and debate about ordination. This is what ordination is. Ordination is the church's public recognition of the private call of God on the life of an individual. All right, that's what it is, all right? It's saying we are setting you aside for ministry because we recognize that God has set you apart, all right? And there was a few years ago, a lot of debate on the ordination of women, all right? And I'm not here to further that debate. What I am here to say is understand that the ordination of anybody is simply recognizing that this person has been called to ministry. Now, what I've always said is if you are going to disenfranchise a whole group of people based on their gender, I'm not going to argue with you about that, except to say, if ordination is simply the church saying, this person is called by God, and then you're saying, but you can't say that to Pastor X because they're female, then why did you hire them if you didn't think they were called? Okay? I'm not hiring somebody who I don't think is called. Okay? So what the church has basically done is to say, we will hire you, which should mean that we think you're called, but we will not recognize that calling, simply based on your gender. All right? All right. So Charles Kinney was the first person that the church said, first African American that the church said was called. Now, you can imagine how difficult it was for him to be, in essence, the only black Adventist pastor in the church in the 1890s. Okay. Now, now I'm going to say some difficult things today. So let me put some stuff on the table before I say it, lest I come across as some angry old black man. Let me tell you that I love the Adventist church. I believe this is God's church. My grandmother joined this church after hearing Edson White preach on the Morning Star in Vicksburg, Mississippi. Okay? When I was growing up as a teenager, I had no non-Adventist relatives on either side of my family. So I call myself the king of the Adventists. Now, I'm not saying that mostly. That's just how I grew up. All right. I am as Adventist as my roots are Adventist, all Adventist schools, and then became an Adventist preacher. All right. So, I remember, now I married somebody who's exact opposite of me. My wife's family is large, but they're Baptists. So she and her mother and her sister are the only Adventists. So it was kind of interesting when I went to visit her home. Her father, wonderful person, just recently passed away, built my wife's Adventist church and donated to labor. Wonderful person, okay? But he was Baptist. And so I remember going to visit my wife. We weren't married then. I went to visit her in her home in Lexington, Kentucky. This is back in the 70s. And this Sabbath morning, I came into the kitchen, Elder Jefferson, and I heard something I had never heard before in my life. I heard a television playing on the Sabbath. I didn't know televisions worked on the Sabbath. I never heard it before. It sounded, I'm telling you, I had never heard it. That was back before Breath of Life and all those things. I had never heard a television on the Sabbath. And then my mother-in-law was cooking for my father-in-law. I had never been around chitlins before. It was terrible. All y'all who used to be something else before you became Adventists, you need to praise the Lord that he rescued you from how did y'all eat that stuff? I mean, I was just horrified. And then not only did she was doing chitlins, she was fixing them frog legs. I said, it's a zoo up in here. I've never been around it. So you are never going to see anybody more Adventist than me. All right? But, here's the but. Both the United States, which is the greatest country in the world, in my opinion, both the United States and the Seventh-day Adventist Church have an ugly history of racism. They do. I wish it weren't true, but it's true. And we live in a country now where people who don't share our history are taking a position, we don't want to talk about it because it makes us uncomfortable. Well, if it makes you uncomfortable to hear it, how uncomfortable do you think it was to live it? Okay? The Seventh-day Adventist Church, instead of leading society, followed society. The Adventist Church back in the day was every bit as segregated as the world was. Right? Now, I either can tell you that or not tell you the truth. All right? So I'm about to tell you some things that are going to be uncomfortable. All right? But it's a part of our history. And don't ask me to not talk about my history. All right? All right, so this is what happened to Charles Kinney. It was rough for him. There were literally years when he didn't get paid. Years. Okay? Then when he got ordained, so he comes in here with his black family in Nashville, Tennessee, and he wants to sit down. He wants his family to sit down. But there's a problem. Black people can't sit in the same place where white people sit. So there was all kind of drama at his ordination. And Charles Kinney was the first person to say, you know what? We're not leaving the church. Not leaving it. It's God's church. But it may be better for us to have our own entities. All right? Here's the second person that was pivotal. I'm telling you about 3 people. Pivotal in Black Adventist history. Claude Barnett. Now, he happened to be pivotal without being an Adventist. Elder Edmond, how can he be pivotal in Adventist history without being an Adventist? I'm glad you asked that question. He was a journalist, a newspaper person, okay? Back in those days, it's 30s and the 40s. If you were black, you weren't writing for the Washington Post and the New York Times and those guys. you had to write for black newspapers. Yeah, if you old like me, you remember black newspapers, right? Okay, he was one of the foremost black newspaper reporters. He had a friend, Owen Troy Sr., Owen Troy Jr. now is one of our oldest retirees. But he had a friend who told him how difficult it was to be a black Adventist in a segregated church. He told him things like this. At the General Conference headquarters in Tacoma Park, it was in Tacoma Park then, in Silver Springs now. At the General Conference headquarters at lunchtime, guess who was not eating in the General Conference cafeteria? Anybody black. No, not just one, anybody. Think about that for a minute. At the world headquarters of God's church, you could not eat. Okay? At Andrews. Well, I went to the seminary. Did you go to Andrews, Dr. Banks? Yeah, well, we went to the seminary. You could eat in the cafeteria, but you had to eat at the colored table. Y'all remember we were colored? Yeah, you had to eat. Yeah. That's the church that we lived in the 1930s and in the 1940s. All right. But then came the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. Lucy Byard. Okay? Okay, the pastor wants to know how many of you have heard of Lucy Byard. Okay, okay. See, we got some work to do, don't we? Okay, Lucy Byard was from, she was of Caribbean descent. We didn't really have a picture of her. This is what we think she looked like, based on, we were able, when I say we, I mean the church, found her, the only relative that we knew that was living, and they helped us do this painting. This is actually a picture of the painting, because I surely could not afford the picture. Oh my goodness, the picture costs just tons of money, all right? But she was probably lighter complexion than that. Okay, Lucy Byard was a black lady of Caribbean descent who had a form of cancer. In fact, it was fatal. Okay, but she wanted to be treated in an Adventist hospital. Adventist health care is big business. Okay, Adventist health care is the only place in the Adventist church where there's money. All right, because they are not all. Past Dr. Banks and Principal Nugent and I, we're all paid according to a wage scale. All of us are paid according to a scale, and the scale is tied to what your job is and how many years. And then here's the bad part is, at a certain point, you hit the top of the scale, and then you get no more, you just get cost of living raises, but that's it, all right? So your salary gets kind of capped, all right? So, but the healthcare system does not operate on the denominational pay scale, all right? So I tell everybody, if you ever get a chance to work for the Adventist healthcare system, I know Dr. Banks, you love these people, but I have to tell you, if the healthcare system you gotta go. In fact, if they call me right now, the meeting is over. Come on, say amen. I'm raptured away to work for the healthcare system. All right. Okay. So she wanted to be to give you an idea of how big Advent Health is. The Orlando Magic, the NBA player, they play in Advent Health Arena. That's how big Adventist healthcare is. In the state of Florida, the largest employer is not Disney, it's Advent Health. Okay. Huge deal. Okay. All right, so she wanted to be treated. So she was admitted in what was called Washington Sanitarium. I forget what it's called now, but it's Washington Sanitarium. There was a problem though. Both the state of Maryland, which was bad enough, and the Adventist Church, which was worse, had a policy that black people could not be treated in white hospitals. Okay, so, but because she was light-skinned, She passed. Y'all remember the days when we could pass? She passed for white until they discovered she was not white, she was black, at which point they kicked her out. This dying woman, they kicked her out of the hospital, sent her across town to Freedman's Hospital, which is now Howard University Hospital, which is now an Adventist hospital. A young lady, well, she's not young because she's my age, but a lady that I grew up with in Allegheny West Conference is the CEO of the hospital. Her W-2 is a lot different than mine, even though we grew up together. But they sent her to Freedman's Hospital where she died, okay, which caused a huge uproar. But because God is in control, it didn't happen just anywhere. It happened in a place where for that time there was a large Black Adventist church that had for its time a large number of well-educated Black people, all right? You know some of them. Eva B. Dykes, okay? If you went to Oakwood, or if you've been to Oakwood, Eva B. Dykes was the first Black woman, not the first Black Adventist woman, but the first Black woman, period, to finish the requirements for a PhD. She went to that church. The second woman to finish the requirements went to that church. A number of educated. There was a lady by the name of Helen Suglin, who, when I was growing up, ran Joyland for camp meeting. She later became my principal. I wish I had known then what I know now. She went to that church, and they did what Adventists do. They formed a committee, and they in essence, petitioned and protested to the General Conference. We've had enough. Enough segregation in administration. Do you know it took the Adventist church 100 years before they had the first Black administrator at the General Conference? 100 years, okay? There were schools, Adventist schools, that Black students could not attend, could not get into. All of whom were not in the South. Some of them were in the North, all right? So this group said, listen, we've had enough, and as a result of their, am I turning this right? Yeah, as a result of their petitioning, the General Conference met. We tend to think the General Conference only meets every 5 years. They actually meet twice a year. That's the General Conference Executive Committee. They meet twice a year, in the spring and in the fall. And in 1944, the General Conference voted to allow what were called colored conferences, okay? And then they said something very important. They said in the voted action, colored conferences to be administered by colored pastors and colored laymen. Why was that important? Because up until then, Black people were not allowed to run much of anything, okay? If you grew up, and I mean, now I wasn't back there then, I'm not that old, but if you grew up, when I grew up, the only Black leaders you saw were in the church. There were no Black mayors, there were no Black governors, there were no Black senators. The idea that a Black person would be president of the United States, that was unthinkable, okay? So it was very important for them to say, let me give you three really bad examples. Okay, the first example was, because there were no Black conferences then, the General Conference ran the work for Black people. They had what was called the Negro department. By then we had graduated from being colored to Negroes, okay? They had, just like you have a women's ministry department and a youth department, they had a Negro department. But guess what the ethnicity of the first 3 men to run the Negro department? Guess what ethnicity they were? They were Caucasians. The first several presidents of Oakwood, they were Caucasians. Even in Africa, the work was led by white Europeans and white North Americans, okay? Imported to run the work. And it was only when the black people in Africa said, enough, we'll run our own stuff, that the church exploded to the point that half of all Seventh-day Adventists live on the continent of Africa. You know what that means? When you put together the people who live in Africa and the people whose roots are in Africa, that's black people in North America, black people in the Caribbean, black people in Europe. Did you know the largest demographic group in the church by far? There's no other group that comes close. The largest group, the largest demographic group in the Seventh-day Adventist Church by far are people of African descent. Somebody should have said amen. And when you add our Latino brethren together, about 80% of our church is of color. And it is growing more of color every year because last year approximately 80% of the baptisms came from Africa and the Caribbean and like that, okay? So it was important that the General Conference say to be administered by colored laymen and colored pastors. All right, here's the second thing that you may have missed. Notice that regional conferences were started not by black people getting mad and leaving, but regional conferences were started by a vote of an overwhelmingly white General Conference. You know what that means? It means that in a choice between integration and regional conferences, the church voted regional conferences. Okay. So this is what makes this so ironic. Now our Caucasian brethren, bless their hearts, are saying, let's all come together. That means two things. Number one, it doesn't mean they're coming to regional conferences. Doesn't mean that at all. What am I trying to say? Doesn't mean that at all. Now this is what y'all will do. This is what y'all will do. Now I know everybody loves Dr. Banks, so nobody would ever do this. But y'all get mad at the pastor, and you know what you do? You run across town. That's what you do. But let me ask you a question. When was the last time somebody in a state conference church said, I'm mad, I'm joining Ephesus? I am for diversity. As a conference president, I hired the first Caucasians to be pastors and school teachers. I hired the first females. I hired the first Korean. I believe in diversity, but I'm also realistic. I know that in the United States and in the Adventist Church, diversity is a one-way street. The only reason why we have diversity is because people of color leave our institutions and go to the majority culture. If that did not happen, we would not have any kind of diversity, all right? Let me put it another way. How many Caucasians are at Oakwood? Yeah, probably about two. Yeah, okay. Now, but ask yourself, how many black people are at Washington Adventist University? Okay. Now, when I was a student, Washington Adventist was called Columbia Union. That was an overwhelmingly Caucasian school. It's not that anymore. Okay? Now, and I'm gonna tell you what is the most likely scenario. That at some point, Washington Adventist University goes the way of Atlantic Union College. It doesn't exist anymore. You know why it doesn't exist? Because too many of y'all came. Now we will run and say, this is what parents have told me. I don't want to send my child to Oakwood because I believe in diversity. We have defined diversity only to mean the presence of the majority culture. Which means if you don't have the majority culture, you don't have diversity. That's not true. Diversity is a mixture of cultures. Okay? How many of you have parents or you yourself came from somewhere else other than the United States? Let me see your hands. Okay. We have diversity in this room. Okay? But most people wouldn't say we have a whole lot of diversity. All right? Because we've defined diversity very narrowly. All right? Okay? But this is the problem, and I'm ahead of myself, but I'll say it now. We have to be very realistic. As black people, we are in search of a diversity that is not in search of us. You cannot integrate with people who do not want to integrate with you. The ugly and inconvenient truth in the United States and in the Adventist church, if enough black people come to a majority culture entity, after a while, they become the majority culture. Let me put it another way. If y'all come, that's just, it's that. So when people throw rocks at regional conferences, it's because they will either don't know or will not accept the fact that for the sake of mission, regional conferences are the best thing that have happened to the church. Because number one, it has allowed us to reach people of color at a rate that's 4 times faster than the rest of the church. Number two, it allows us to do what no one else is going to do, and that is take the gospel to people with whom we share a common culture. And that is always the easiest way to spread the gospel. It's not the only way. While we have a responsibility to people of color, that's not our only responsibility. We have a responsibility to take the gospel to every nation, kindred, tongue, and people, which means people besides our own culture. And I'll give you an example. Gentrification means Caucasians have moved back into the inner city. Okay? Somebody has to reach them. That somebody is us. We're going to have to figure out, Dr. Banks, how to do what we were not trained to do. Okay? And it requires an entirely different ministry, because usually when you're talking about the inner city, we're talking about, okay, let's have a food drive, let's have a clothes. No, you're talking about people who moved into your neighborhoods and then turn those houses into $1 million houses. They don't need a food drive. They own the food. All right? So it requires an entirely different way of thinking, entirely different, but we got to do it. Now, we haven't done it yet. I'm going to tell you the first person who said that. That's your late president, Elder Fordham. He's the first person that said that. Okay? And he's absolutely right. Capitol Hill is a prime example. The church in Capitol Hill, man, them brothers have $1 million homes. It's just ridiculous. Okay? You gotta reach those people. Within walking distance of their church. All right? I went to preach at Ebenezer in Philadelphia, West Philadelphia. I remember the Fresh Prince, West Philadelphia, born and raised. Yeah, that's the hood, all right? The church is in the hood. But when we left the church, turned the corner, it was a bunch of Caucasians who have moved into that area. Somebody has to reach them, all right? All right, so we have a responsibility. But our first responsibility is to the people of our own culture. And it's all, so when people talk about regional separation, no, it's not separation. It's mission specificity, all right? Let me give you an example. The regional conferences have been asked to work with the Inter-American Division in what is going to be a huge evangelistic thrust. They want to do 500,000 Bible studies. And then they want to do meetings after those 500,000 Bible studies. And they've said, okay, regional conferences, we want you to send some pastors. So the regional conferences are sending pastors over to Inter-America to do the meeting. I got assigned, although I signed up to preach in Trinidad, the time of year I could go, they didn't have meetings. So they assigned me to Honduras. Okay? Honduras is a Spanish-speaking country. So I said, okay, if I'm going to go there, I got to have my sermons, cut in half, okay? Because you're having a translator, all right? So imagine, and I do apologize, my sermon went longer than what I intended today. But imagine if I had a translator, we would have been here forever. All right. So whenever you preach in another country, you're dependent on somebody else. Okay. So I said, no, I don't want to do that. So I'm going at another type of year. So my point is, it is easier for somebody to speak Spanish in a Spanish-speaking country. It's always easier to reach somebody with whom you share a culture. That's all the black experience in the United States is so unique that it's almost like a different culture, right? And so the easiest way to reach people is somebody else who shares a culture. That's why we have regional conferences, all right? All right. Let's go on. I should have said, if there are questions, don't hesitate to stop me, okay? Now, here are some iconic figures. You've all heard of them. E.E. Cleveland, C.D. Brooks, who was my first pastor, Charles Bradford, Charles Dudley. 3 of the 4 of these men got their start in regional conferences. The 4th, Elder Bradford, he got hired just before the regional conference got started. Now, the truth of the matter is, all of these gentlemen either got started in the South or were in the South or were from the South. Had there been no regional conference, it's possible that at least some of them would have never gotten hired. Imagine a church without those 4 men. Okay. There's some regional conference entities, blah, blah, blah. Okay, here's where we're going to close. Elder Edmond, you've talked about history. Tell me why I still need regional conferences, why we still need them. Here's the first one. Regional conferences allow us to control our own resources, okay? Without regional conferences, then, and we know this to be true because in the West Coast, there are no regional conferences. In order for them to operate what they do, they are dependent on the conference and the union giving them money to operate, all right? Whereas regional conferences are dependent on what you give them as opposed to what somebody else gives them to operate, right? So without regional conferences, there would be no regional Charles Dudley building. That's my office. We named it after Elder Dudley. That on the left. It's a beautiful building. And there would be no regional conference retirement plan without regional conferences controlling their own resources. That's very important. Controlling your own resources means you can decide for yourself the direction of your ministry. Okay. Number two, regional conferences are the best way to reach people of color with the gospel of Jesus Christ. And we showed you that they've done that at a rate 4 times faster than the rest of the Church in North America. Regional conferences give people of color a seat at the denominational decision-making table. When I was a conference president, I was a delegate automatically to the General Conference because I was a conference president. Each conference president is a delegate. Okay? If regional conferences didn't have their own entities, if there were no regional conferences, we would be left to be in a room where we're outnumbered, raising our hands saying, hey, we need some representation. Give us some representation. We don't have to ask because we have our own entities. All right? Very important. If you're not in the room where people are making decisions about you, you're in trouble. You either have a seat at the table or you're an item on the menu. Okay. You have to be in the room, all right? And that's what regional conferences do. Regional conferences are a better economic model. We just showed you that. It costs way less to operate the 9 regional conferences than the 30 state conferences in that same territory. Regional conferences are one of the great success stories. If I'm trying to operate 2 businesses and one of them costs less money but grows 4 times faster, which one of those am I going to keep? Now, we need both. We need both. But the idea that you don't need the lesser in terms of expenses but greater in terms of productivity, that's a joke. Nobody would say that in any other entity other than the Adventist church. You would never say that in the corporate world. You would never say, let's shut down the entity that's less expensive but more productive. You would never say that. And the only reason why we say it is because we don't know our own history. Black churches are often the only Seventh-day Adventist church inside the city limits of most churches, most cities. But the cities are where people live. But black churches are the only churches in a lot of cities inside the city limits. And then lastly, racism is not dead, nor is it likely to die. It's a sad thing that we're talking about some of the same things in the United States that we were talking about when I was a little boy. Okay? I remember when Barack Obama got elected. I remember to the minute when he got elected. And I remember sitting in my home and saying, maybe things are going to change. Okay? And they have changed, but not to the extent that we thought. Okay? And there's actually, and the hard reality is, historically, after there has been progress, there is always pushback. Always. All right. Now, let's close with 3 myths about regional conferences. They are a relic of segregation. Okay, think about this. Again, when you don't know your own history, you allow other people to control the narrative. How in the world are regional conferences a relic of segregation if state conferences are also not a relic of segregation? Both of them, either neither is true or both have to be true. All right? Here's the biggest myth of all. If regional conferences would go away, we could all come together. Well, first of all coming together depends on how you define we all come together, okay? But then remember I told you, there are no There are no regional conferences out west, from Arizona back west. Everything is a state conference, all right? I've had the privilege probably to preach in about 20 churches out west. 2 of them are integrated. The reality is the other 18 are every bit as segregated as any church in a regional conference, okay? So our West Coast brethren don't have integration, and neither do they have the structure that gives them the voice that black people have in regional conferences. So to me, that's the worst of both worlds. No integration and no voice, all right? So the idea that if regional conferences went away, now if you listen to certain people, that's how we all gonna come together. Y'all need to just shut down. Which is really the equivalent of them saying, because regional conferences they weren't voted by us, they were voted by our brethren. So think about the irony of that. What our brethren who say that are really saying is, we were not ready for a regional conference, we were not ready for integration. That's the reason why we gave you our regional conferences. But now we are ready for at least a form of integration, meaning as long as we are in the majority, we're okay with integration. And to the extent we are okay with integration, we want y'all to close down the entities that we made you start when we weren't ready for integration. But now, does that make sense? But when you don't know your history, you swallow that Kool-Aid that says, okay, we need to get rid of our stuff in favor of, then think about that for a minute. If we really did if regional conferences went away, there would be no more integration than we have now, because the segregation is not at the conference level, it's at the church level, okay? And if all y'all closed your church today and went across town, guess what would happen to that church? It would be segregated again. And let me give you an example. I can give you several. The Greater New York Conference. The Greater New York Conference is a state conference church that used to be white, all right? It's in New York. Today, I don't think you can find a single majority Caucasian church in the entire state of New York, okay? Now, you may be, I don't know of any, but it's not more than a couple. All right, so you know what that means? It means over time, a whole conference disappeared. Whole conference. Did y'all hear what I said? A whole conference. Now, so the question is, in New York City, because we're not talking about some little small town in Virginia. We're talking about New York City, which is the largest city in the country by far. Are you telling me there are no white Adventists in New York City? Where did they, remember there was a whole conference. Where did they go? There's only one of three answers, ladies and gentlemen. Here's possibility number one. They all died. They all died. They're like the children of Israel. They all died. You know how they couldn't enter into the promised land until everybody 20 and over died. But see, even their children were, so that's not even, because they still had children left. Okay, they all died. So we know that's not true. Here's option number two. They all disappeared in the Hudson River. It's like Atlantis. They all live in the sea somewhere. Okay, that's not true. The only thing left is faced with a choice between going to a church that is no longer majority Caucasian and not going at all. They've chosen not to go at all. are in search of a diversity that is not in search of us. Okay, now, is a lot of that racism? Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, but it's not all racism. Some of it is just cultural. You know, you're comfortable with what you're used to. All right? And there's nothing wrong with people of the same culture saying we all gonna worship together. What is wrong is when you just say we gonna worship together and none of y'all can come. Like back in the bad old days when we would go to churches that weren't black and they would meet us at the door and say, the black church is across town. Okay? And everybody my age and up has a story like that, or they know of a story like that. That's the church that the Adventist church was. Okay? And for us to pretend like it's not, is intellectually dishonest, and it also keeps us from saying, listen, that's who we were, but we're determined not to be that again. Okay? All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, we just told you the integration is not, it's a two-way street. And here's the greatest threat. And I actually may have forgotten to tell you what the third one was. Yeah, we're seeking integration, right. Okay. And here's the greatest threat to regional conferences: not knowing and not telling our own story and passing it down to our children, to whom we depend on maintaining this wonderful legacy that the Lord has given to us and that has been a blessing to his work. Now, that's my email, but that's not important. If you look at AdventistRegionalMinistries.org, that's our website, and that's where you can find a regional voice, all right? So you don't have to pay for it. You can just go online and you get it. Okay, I am done. Are there any questions? Yes, ma'am, in the back. I don't know if was there a Greater New York Academy? Okay. There may, I wish I knew the answer to that question. Okay. Don't know. Good question. If it is, it's black.
My question is, racial prejudice amongst ourselves. If you all thought about or put something together on how to really deal with that, different levels of earning, where you live. You spoke on that a little bit about where you live, all of that, and then how we're prejudiced amongst ourselves.
Yeah. We have tried to address the cultural issues. We haven't talked so much about the economic, but I'll give you an example of the cultural issues. To me, one of the dumbest fights in the history of the world is any kind of cultural issue among black people. That is, and the most common one is black people in the United States versus black people in the United States but who came from the Caribbean. That's one of the dumbest fights ever. Which by the way, the inability of black people not to fight amongst themselves, I think is contributory to the fact that the leadership is less of color than the church is. Okay, the church is overwhelmingly a church of color. And I remember when I was in Africa, one of the younger pastors said to me, Elder Edmond, when are we gonna have a black president of the General Conference? And I said to them, okay, wait, whoa, hold up. That's not why I'm here. Didn't come to do that. But since you asked, I said, we're gonna have one when y'all decide, because you are the biggest thing in the church, you know. But you know, that's why it's amusing to me when people say, well, our Caucasian brethren have figured out a way to pit us against. We don't need anybody we don't have to have anybody to come up with some great scheme. We do that to ourselves. And one of the dumbest fights is black people in the United States versus black people in the Caribbean. We all came from the same place. I just tell my Caribbean brother, y'all just got dropped off in better weather. But we all started off in the same place. And so the idea that, the idea that pits us up against each other, that's insane. But it's a byproduct of sin. So it's probably a conversation we need to have more of. Elder Jefferson.
Why did we lose Riverside, Jefferson, Sanitary, Southern Publishing Association, and having these hospitals in D.C., the same principle?
Let me give you it's easy. Oh, okay, yeah. He was asking about 3 black entities that we don't have anymore. Hadley Hospital was in Washington. And what was the other one you mentioned? Southern Publishing and Riverside. Riverside was black. I don't know how black Southern Pub was. I mean, it certainly had a lot of black people, but the leadership may not have been black. To be fair, while in the United States, you can never unfortunately, you can never dismiss the possibility of racism. It's just a fact of life. To be fair, though, there were probably economic explanations. I sat on the board of Advent Health. Advent Health, I'm not saying they're completely, I'm not naive enough to think that racism never enters their mind, but Advent Health, green is more important than black and white, And so you're talking about, I've seen them close white entities that were, the black hospital in Nashville doesn't exist, but neither does the white one. There was a white hospital. It doesn't exist either. So they're more bottom line based, okay? If in terms of Southern Publishing, any kind of print entity is a challenge now. I used to have 4 magazines sent to my house. All 4 of the ones that I had sent to my house don't exist anymore. Okay, well, one of the 4 does, but it's on its last legs. Publishing is very difficult to do. Not only did Southern Pub go out of business, but the Review and Herald Publishing went out of business. So publishing is print journalism, print anything is difficult. Newspapers, so even if there was racism, there's also an economic explanation attached to it, and I can see I sense the racism because I've had to live with that, but I can see the economics. Okay. Anybody else? Okay. Oh, yes, ma'am, in the back.
When the denomination was started, the structure that we have now probably started back then when you talk about the world church.
Yes.
Has there been any discussion about looking at that and changing it, or is it still appropriate in today's world as it was back then?
Good question. And actually, I was talking to your pastor at dinner. Any entity that's a nonprofit entity is harder to change because there's not a profit motive. Okay? In other words, I'll give you the example of an entity that I won't name, but I worked with for a number of years. They were running 6-figure deficits every year, for several years, all right? But nobody did anything about it because it did not personally affect anybody. You see what I'm saying? Now, if it were a corporate structure and I had stock, and there were stockholders, those stockholders would not have stood for that. You know, they would have said, listen, fix it or we getting rid of you. Okay? So it's difficult to change anything in a nonprofit, not impossible, but it's much easier to kick the can down the road. To talk about changing it without actually changing it, okay? And even though I love our church, we are good at talking about something without ever doing anything about it, okay? Because doing something about it often means making very difficult decisions. In a corporate structure, you either make those decisions or somebody makes a decision that we're gonna make a difficult decision, and that is to get rid of you and get somebody else, because you costing us money. Okay, that profit motive doesn't exist. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is nobody ever. This is how we are. We want change so long as you have to change, but I don't. Okay, we want change that's comfortable for us. Change that makes us uncomfortable, we're not in favor of. So I've heard for years we have too many colleges. I think we have 12 now, okay? The reality is there is a shrinking number of students in almost all those colleges, and there's two reasons for that. First of all, the commitment level to Adventist education that existed when my parents were around, and when I was a parent, doesn't exist today. It doesn't. It just doesn't, okay? The second thing, I said two reasons, actually three. The second thing is the cost of Adventist education is just, and it's only gonna go one way until the Lord comes. So one of the things that scares me, I'm gonna be really honest. I shared it with the executive committee. Pine Forge scares me. Okay, the cost of operating Pine Forge is only gonna go one way until the Lord comes, and that's up. It already costs $1 zillion to send your child there. It's already beyond the reach of the average black parent. Okay, it's just gonna become more unreachable with time. You know, unless we figure out another way to get revenue besides tuition. Okay, okay. So I started to say I'm gonna leave it. I'm gonna stop there. Okay, so that's number two. The cost just keeps. It's just gonna keep on going up. Okay, but here's the third reason that most people haven't thought about, and that is there's just fewer children. You ladies don't have children at the same rate that people used to have children. You know, I have two sisters and a brother. There's four of us. The four of us together don't have 4 children. Okay? When I was growing up, all my friends had 4 and 5 siblings. How many families do you know today that have 5 kids? No, it's not too many. So one of the challenges is there's simply fewer children. You know, and that's not going to change unless you ladies decide to change it. You know, you know, that's not going to change. So we see there are times when we see stuff coming down the track, but it's easier for us to talk about it. And I'll give you 2 more examples, and I'm finished with this question. Having fewer children in our schools means fewer workers are being trained. Okay. Last year we graduated at Oakwood. We graduated 5 education majors. 5. Okay? And it's not just Oakwood. That's everywhere. Southern did 5. I think Andrews did 5. Okay, this is how bad it is. This is how bad it is. One of the things my office does is it hosts every year a day where the regional presidents come and interview potential theology students to hire in their conference. Office hires that. This year we expanded that to include business students who work in our Treasury Department and education majors. So we had 9 education superintendents. You know how many education majors they interviewed? 2. 2. We had 9 people interviewing 2 students. Okay? All right. So we have a problem. Now we have a bigger problem in education, but we don't have as many theology students graduating either. The reason why that hasn't become a problem yet is because there's only so many we can hire anyway. When you and I were in school, we had like a zillion theology majors. Never could hire all of them. Okay, so we still have more than we can hire. Okay, so even though we have far less, it's not as a problem because the supply is still greater than demand. That's not true of the teachers at all. So we're headed towards a day, unless we can find some more young people like your principal, we're headed for a day where we will close schools, not because we don't have students. That used to be the problem. The next problem is we closing your school because we can't find a teacher. Okay, now that's where we're headed. We know that's where we're headed. The challenge is, are we going to do more than just talk about it? Or are we going to try to fix it? Okay? And see, here's how that's an even bigger problem in regional conferences. One of the advantages of the state conferences, they just got more money. Now, we will say things like, oh, but regional conferences aren't well run. Okay, let's see. Let me give you an example of why that's not true. All right? South Atlantic Conference covers Georgia, North Carolina, and South Carolina, right? In that same territory are 2 state conferences, Carolina, which is North and South Carolina, and Georgia Cumberland, which is Georgia and East Tennessee, right? The combined state, the South Atlantic's tithe is $30 million. The 2 state conferences combined tithe is $100 million. $100 million. Each of us do 25% to the higher entities. So when they write their 25%, they got $75 million left. Which means before the South Atlantic person writes their first check, they're $45 million behind. You give me $45 million and see what I do. It's not, they're not better at business, they just got more money. I'd like to see what they do if they had our money. Okay? But we don't, because we don't know our history, we throw rocks at our own stuff. Say, oh, we came from, blah, blah, blah. Okay? Okay. Now, our issue is, see, we can't afford, we got to fix this because they have more money. This is what they can do. This is what they can do, Ms. Nugent. Okay, so you coming out of school, right? Okay, you coming out of school right now, right? So you got $40,000 worth of student loan debt, all right? Okay, now maybe you didn't because you had, your mom was a church school teacher. You didn't have no money either. So, but let's say you had student loan debt, right? Okay, you got $40,000 worth of student loan. You know what Potomac Conference is going to do? They're going to say, come work for us. We'll pay off your student loan. That's what they've done that already. Okay? So now it's only two of them. So where do you think they're gonna go? I just wrote off your student loan and I'm gonna pay for your master's. Where's she gonna go? See, we already know what the deal is. And so we can either sit around and lament it. I told Dr. Banks, I said, our favorite book in the Bible is Lamentations, because we just want to lament stuff. No. We already know that there's not enough of her. We already know that. And we do know the few little people like her that are graduating, Potomac is, and all them rich boys, they are competing. So then the question is, what are we going to do about it? Instead of saying, oh, whoa, no, that's not going to get it done. We got to have a plan that addresses the shortage. And so far, our plan has been to talk about it. I saw somebody, yes.
How are the other churches, and maybe smaller than Ephesus, going to get a chance to learn what we learned today? And how, I mean, there's a reason as well as help educators, because it would seem that it's kind of, is it ignorance?
There is, yeah, there is. Yes. Well, we're doing a couple of things. One of the things that I do is I have this conversation often. That's my job, to have these and we will, it's not just, we don't just go to the big churches, we go to the small churches. Okay, but it's only one person. So what we said we were going to do is we're going to put this on a video on our website because there is virtually no one knows what I just told you. There's an alarming lack. Even at Oakwood, that's our entity, and we don't know our story on our campus, which is why we put a museum in our building of Adventist African history. That's one of the very few African American history museums in the world. And one of them is in our building. Yeah. Okay. Yes, Dr. Banks.
So with this knowledge, I've always thought about how we can pass this down to our students. Most schools today have a class on their university, like life at, I don't know, ECU students. Is there some sort of life at ECU class or anything like that?
We have orientation that teaches you about some, and then I think there is a class that you can take that has different programs associated with it.
Okay, so our point is, this should be a class.
It should be.
That's required for every freshman or whatever, before you graduate, just to keep that knowledge going.
And without trying to throw anybody under the bus, I've had that discussion. I've had the discussion with the education superintendents, that we need to have this kind, and everybody nods there and says, yeah, it's a good idea, and then nobody does anything. And it's a problem. And if there's anything that will end regional conferences, it's not, when I was a young administrator, the older guys used to say, oh, the Caucasians are going to come and shut us down. Well, the way most constitutions are written, only the conference itself can shut the conference itself. But this is terrible. And so, man, I was young, and I was, regional conferences forever. I'm ready to fight. But not with this is what I've discovered after going around the country. And that's what I do. I'm trying to think of where I was last week. But I did this somewhere last week, I don't remember. But the week before that, I was in Seattle, that area. The week before that, somewhere else on the West Coast. So that's what I do. And one of the things that is scary to me is the lack of knowledge, period, just across the board. And the only way to fix that is education. But the only way to fix that is, well, one of the few ways to fix it is you start telling your story to children. I'm actually having the same conversation at Greater Atlanta Adventist Academy on Monday morning, okay? But that's not enough. That's not enough. It needs to be a class, and it needs to start on the elementary level. But to get that past, and every time I say everybody does just what all y'all did, no, nod their head, and then that's the end of it. Okay. Did I see your hand, young lady? Yes, ma'am. Okay, now I know you can talk louder than that.
When you say you had that conversation with superintendents, that's of K-12 schools, like getting an education course?
The regional conference superintendents, I had that conversation.
So is this a conversation that you could possibly have with deans of the Adventist universities and colleges? Because like Pastor Vic said, that could be a course that freshmen have to take. I know at ECU, even though we're not religiously associated, there are the Gen Ed student have to take. And there's a choice, but 3 classes that every single student has to take is a series of writing classes. So maybe it could be either one class or a series of classes where you learn not only just the African American history of Seventh Day Adventist Church, but the entire history of the Seventh Day Adventist Church, because that's not already a course out there. Or even if it is, they could add a section about African American leadership.
And it's a very good suggestion. I do not run in those circles. I would love, though, and I've had this discussion at Oakwood. I'd love to see that at Oakwood. And now, to be fair, it is a lot easier for me to say, y'all need to have a class than for them to actually make it happen. You can't just say, let's have a class. You know, there's an infrastructure that's involved in that. I personally think there needs to be a Black Studies minor at Oakwood, where you're not just looking at Adventist history, which I think is the first thing we need to look at, but just Black history, period. You know, but to do that would require millions of dollars, you know, to create an infrastructure. So I think sometimes it's just like in the church. There are things we want to do, and they're not being done, not because we don't want to do it. We haven't figured out a way how to do it. But it is something we need to, it is something we need to do if we're going to survive. Okay, yes, ma'am. And we've had that conversation as well.
Whether or not you have to do the honors.
Yeah.
I know we have honors that are required no matter where you are. What if we could make that a required honor across the board with Pathfinder so that everybody's learning? Because it doesn't matter what side of the aisle you are, conference-wise. This is church history. It's not just Black history or white history. It's church history. And I know we have that honor. We get paid to fight with it.
And we've had that discussion, but I'm glad you brought it up, because what it will make me do, if I remember, which at my age is kind of a challenge, but if I remember, we have a new set of Black conference youth directors. So again, my thing is, okay, even if they don't do it on the NAD level, we need to do it on the regional conference level. So you guys, you ladies and gentlemen, have given me renewed energy to pick up that fight again. To say, and it's not a fight, it's just, the fight is to get us from, because every time I bring it up, they do it, all y'all are doing. They nod, and then that's the end of it. You know, so that would be the fight, to get it passed. Because in a perfect world, this is what I'd like to have. I'd like it, at minimum, I can't do anything about what the state conferences do. But at minimum, we need to do it. We need to do it at Oakwood, we need to do it at our schools, and we need to do it with our Pathfinders. If nobody else does it, we need to do it. So that's a fight I'm gonna pick up again. Now I'm seeing hands. Now, okay, at this point, I'm done. So if we're here, it's not on me anymore. It's on you all. So, because I want to respect your time, and you all have been wonderful. If you have a question or comment, let me see your hand, and then we'll wrap up with whoever's got their hand up. Okay, we'll start with her, then we'll go in the back, and then we'll close with Elder Jefferson. Is that everybody? I catch everybody? Did I catch everybody? Now, inevitably, this happens to me all the time. We all agree to stop, and then somebody, and then they get mad when I say, no, we said, okay. So, all right. I know, but I'm trying to be respectful of your time. So if after these 3 questions, if there's a question you want to pose to me personally, we'll let the group go, and then you can ask your question. All right, yes, ma'am. In the short term, the regional conferences appear to, from me looking at it from the outside, because I'm no longer involved directly with the conference like I was when I was in South Central. But let me give you a couple statistics. The regional conference tithe, which is the first thing I look at. I shouldn't say that. I should be the first thing I should be looking at is baptisms. But if you don't have money, you can't do ministry. So the tithe, and this was a scary thing when COVID hit. Part of my job is to meet with the presidents, okay? And I still remember, just as COVID was starting out, we had an emergency meeting. And in those days, we didn't know anything about Zoom, so it was a conference call. We had a conference call. And so we met with the regional presidents, and across the board, this is what they said, every last one of them. They said, we are not closing churches. They said, we'll do everything. We're going to follow the law. We won't have communion. We won't do this. We won't do that. But we're not closing churches. The reason why we didn't think we could close churches is because conferences, generally speaking, even in the best of times, operate on a relatively narrow margin. Okay, and that margin is sustained by doing what we did today. The offering time came, we passed the plate. The Adventist Church last year did about $2.7 billion worth of tithe. Pre-COVID, most of that came by passing the plate. So you can imagine what happens when you can't pass that plate anymore. That's the reason why we said not closing churches, not doing that. That was on a Thursday. The next day, I was on a plane headed for Virginia. I was actually preaching in another conference, but the closest airport was in Virginia. I was in the airport, literally about to get on my plane when my phone rang, and it was the young fella where I was going to preach. He said, "Elder Edmond, I'm so sorry. The president just announced all of our churches are closed." That was the beginning of 18 months. If you had told we were thinking then, okay, maybe we can last 2 or 3 months, because at that point, online giving did not exist for most of our churches. At that point, 65% of our churches did not have online giving. Okay, so we thought we were in a heap of trouble. But the Lord blessed. The Lord blessed. I said, Dr. Banks, you sit on executive committee, so you know what this would have meant. I said, okay, if we can keep our tithe loss at 15, down to 15%. Now, you know what would happen if you had a 15% tithe loss. But we were so desperate, I said, okay, if we can only lose 15%, maybe we can survive. No, we couldn't have. But maybe, we were just so desperate. I think we collected roughly 95% of the previous year's tithe, which was a miracle. I mean, an absolute miracle. That was the last time. And the only reason why we had a tithe loss was because the areas that were hit the hardest, Northeastern and Allegheny East, which were our 2 largest conferences, They had larger than normal. If you take out Allegheny East and Northeastern, we wouldn't have had a loss at all. Okay? The next year we had a tithe gain. And so the tithe has gone up almost $40 million in the last 3 years, which is more than went up in the previous 10. Okay? So financially, we're much better off. Now the scary part is on the ministry side, we're not as well off. And at some point, the scary part for me are the challenges on the ministry side going to catch up with the money side? So far, it hasn't at all. Hasn't come close. In fact, financially, the truth of the matter is the best thing that could have happened to us was to have a pandemic from a financial standpoint. Okay? But on the ministry side, particularly on the youth ministry side, okay, and that's scary. Because our Caucasian brethren, they've been struggling with youth ministries, except for Pathfinders, forever. But it doesn't hurt them as much because they got more money. And they also have more institutions. When you have an institutional payroll in your conference, it makes a huge difference. If you look at two of the three largest churches in tithe, they're in Huntsville. The reason why they're in Huntsville is because Oakwood's there. The Oakwood church by itself does more tithe than Central States as a conference. Okay. Oakwood and First Church, which is the other large church in Huntsville, they do almost as much tithe as Allegheny West does in their whole conference. So having an institutional payroll makes a huge difference. But Oakwood is the only institution of that size that black people have. Our Caucasian brethren have a bunch of entities. Like I just told you about Georgia Cumberland. Georgia Cumberland has Southern, and they have the Little Debbie guy. The Little Debbie guy gave South Central $100,000. So if he gave South Central, he's not even a member. What do you think he's doing in Georgia Cumberland? Okay, so they have things that prop them up that we don't have. We got to evangelize. We got to do ministry. And so that's a long way of answering your question. Right now, I feel good. But looking down the road, I'm saying there's some things we got to fix, because we can't buy our way out of stuff the way our Caucasian brethren can. All right. Now where was I going? Okay, everybody's pointing at somebody else. No, I saw you. Before I get to you, okay, I didn't see anybody else. Okay, I'm down to my last two questions. Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir. Benjamin, no, not formally. Benjamin Baker was on our museum committee. He helped us do our museum. So we relied on a lot of his expertise in building our museum. Okay, Benjamin Baker is the son of Delbert Baker, and he is unofficially the black historian. Oh, okay, Delbert Baker used to be, I know you know, but I know I'm saying, because at first I was like, oh, okay, you know that. But I'm saying, now I get it, you're asking for other people. Okay, Delbert Baker used to be the president of Oakwood, used to be vice president of General Conference. He now works in our office as the director of research and development for our retirement program. His son is really the black historian in the Adventist church. Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay, and now you have the last question. Okay. Yes. Okay, here's the doctor, my friend Dr. Pollard, who's the president of Oakwood. He says, he has an expression that goes something like this: we don't have a money problem, we have a faith problem. Okay, so here's one of the reasons why that's difficult. It's not impossible. The first problem is only about half the people in the average Adventist church are faithful in their tithe and offering. Now, I know that's not true of this group here. These are all the people who are supporting the church. But if you think about it, if only half the people are faithful, that means we only have half the money that we have. So instead of a tithe base of roughly 35, 36, 40, close to $40 million, something like that, then if you had $80 million of tithe, that's how you answer that question, you know? So if, not, I'll tell you a school where everybody didn't go free, but most of the children went at half price. And that was in the church that I pastored because the members were so faithful in their local giving that we had the resources that where most of those children went for half price.
We do it here with the Virginia tax credit. It's been very, very helpful for our school's growth. I don't know if you would have survived these last couple of years without your contributions to the Virginia tax credit. However, last year was a down year. We have to turn some families away who otherwise would have been able to attend had we raised, even averaging $40,000 every year. Last year we raised about $20,000.
The harsh reality is what it takes to do something like that is beyond the commitment level of most churches. You know, but the reality is, just to keep what you have, it's going to require an increasing amount of commitment, because the cost of church school is only going to go one way until the Lord comes. And what has tripped up most churches is two things. The fewer children that go from that church to the church school, the less commitment churches tend to have. And one of the reasons why we were able to have the kind of funding that we had in Memphis for our children was most of the people on the board had their children in church school. So when I would come, and this I would literally say this, when I would come to ask for money, I would say to the board, I'm asking for this for your children. Well, when it's somebody else's children, then it's a lot easier to say no, because it's not really my school. But when those are your children, you know, I mean, almost everybody on that board had somebody in that school. So it was like, okay, this is my child. When it's not your child, that's somebody else's school. But here's the thing. The only way Ephesus survives in the future is that you got to keep those children in the church. That's the only way. Because unless y'all have discovered the fountain of youth, 30 years from now, if the Lord hasn't come, who in this group is going to be active and breathing? 30 years from now, I'm not going to be around, you know, and that's true of most of y'all. Let's just be honest, you know. So the future, she dealing with the next. She dealing with Ephesus, and it's hard for us to make that commitment, especially if it doesn't affect our children. So it can be done, but there has to be a commitment to faithfulness. And that's the reason why, when I was a conference president, we were very careful about who we put in churches that had schools, because you got to commit just ungodly amounts of money compared to what you have to the school. The school is, I used to call my children the great income reducers. That's what a school is. It's the great income reducer of the church. But it's something that you have to do, not only for your future, but for the sake of those kids. You gotta do it. And the scary thing is, churches are becoming increasingly unwilling to take the hit. This is what I told my church, and it's a result of being a product of church school. This is what I told my church when I was a young pastor. I said, after we pay the mortgage and we turn on the lights, if every other dime that we spend goes to the school, that's what we got to do. And that almost was true. But the Lord blessed. The Lord blessed. We paid that mortgage off 7 years early. Despite what we were spending, we ended up spending literally 10 times more on church school by the time I left than we were spending when I got there. But the Lord blessed. And at the same time, we were spending all that money to keep those kids in that school. And we were able to double. When I got there, we had 29 kids in school, because it was a constituent school, so it was a bunch of us running it. When I left, we had 80 kids in church school, because I was able to say, okay, you really don't have an excuse, because we gonna help you. We paying half the cost, so you really don't have an excuse. When I would go talk to parents, it was like, okay, tell me why your child is not in our school, because we're writing the check, so we just need the bodies, and we did that. It cost a ton of money, but the Lord blessed. At the same time, we said we needed another building. I told them, I said, we can either educate these children or we can build a building. They said, we're going to educate our kids. And we were able still to pay off that church 7 years early. And after I left, they got another church. So they got everything they wanted, but they still did what the Lord said. So a lot of it is, are we willing to pay the price? And here's where I'm going to close. Here's where I'm going to close after. Oh, you asked your question. Here's where I'm going to close. You might not be willing to pay, but as that old commercial, you pay now or pay later. You going to pay. It's just how you going to pay and who you going to pay, but you going to pay. And I hope that you make the right decision. Well, my thanks to all of you. Turn it back over to Dr. Baker.
Thank you, Elder Edmond. We took the time, he and I guess we've been discussing this about almost nearly a year to get him to come here, and finally we settled on a date I think we were in Phoenix at the time. Yeah, we finally settled on a date. I didn't think it would ever come, but here it is, and I thank you for coming. I hope that you were enlightened, okay, and that we continue to do God's work in this portion of the vineyard. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for staying by. And I think that's all we've got for you today. Okay. I'm going to call on you, Brother Jefferson. Come on, pray us out, please.
I like how sharp you look.
Oh, thank you. Say it louder in the mic. No.
I just told the pastor I like the way he looked. He looked sharp today. Yeah. Clean cut. I tell you, he's dynamite. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for all your goodness and kindness. Help us to be thankful. Help us to give you praise. Thank you for my brother coming and sharing with us, Brother Edmond, and the pastor arranging this over a year ago, and the people who decided to come and stay back and come to church this morning and be blessed. Help us to forgive ourselves and just receive what you have done for us in the past, what you're doing in the present, and the great hope for the future. Give us a great week. Thank you for the Sabbath blessing. Bless our leaders in a very special way. Our husbands and wives and children, grandparents, and those who love us in spite of ourselves. And thank you for the school and the teachers and the supporters. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you.